Imagine a love so powerful, it defies even death. What happens when one man's desire brings his lost love back from the grave? But at what cost? Watch now to uncover the mystery of the resurrection of Amara, a story of love, fate, and the supernatural. Ebuka, a poor but hard-working farmer, has long been in love with Amara, the daughter of Chief Nadozi, one of the wealthiest men in their village. Every time she passes through the market square, her beauty seems to brighten the entire village. The villagers often gossip about how her beauty could only belong to a man of great wealth or status, yet Ebuka's love for her remains undeterred. He watches her from afar, unable to speak of his feelings, knowing that a man of his status would never be accepted into her world. Amara, on the other hand, is courted by many wealthy suitors, including men from neighboring villages. To her, Ebuka is invisible, a mere farmer struggling to make ends meet. One fateful day, the village is shaken by tragic news. Amara has fallen gravely ill. Within days, the sickness takes her life. Her death casts a dark cloud over the village, and people mourn for the loss of their beautiful maiden. Chief Nadozi spares no expense for her burial, ensuring she is laid to rest in a lavish ceremony, with her grave marked by a grand tombstone. As the village mourns, Ebuka is consumed by grief and longing. The thought of Amara being gone forever is too much for him to bear. He avoids the gatherings of villagers and spends his nights wandering alone, lost in thoughts of what could have been. His love for her, unspoken in life, now haunts him in her death. One day after her burial, on a night of a full moon, Ebuka makes a decision that no man of sound mind would ever consider. His obsession with Amara has grown uncontrollable. In the dead of night, when the village is asleep, he sneaks into the cemetery, driven by an overwhelming urge to see her one last time. His heart pounds in his chest as he digs her grave, the moon casting long shadows on the ground around him. As he removes the final layer of earth and opens the wooden coffin, the air seems to grow colder. There lies Amara, her beauty untouched by death, her skin pale but still radiant under the moonlight. The madness within Ebuka takes over, and in that moment, he reaches for her. But something unexpected happens. The wind picks up, and a strange energy fills the air. As Ebuka touches Amara, her body begins to stir. Her eyes flutter open, and a soft gasp escapes her lips. She is alive. Ebuka staggers back, horrified and amazed, as Amara sits up in her grave, dazed and confused. Slowly, her gaze meets his, and for the first time, she truly sees him. "What have you done?" Amara whispers, her voice trembling with fear and bewilderment. Amara sat up, her eyes wide and filled with confusion. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she took in her surroundings, the open grave, the cold night air, and the trembling figure of Ebuka standing before her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick with shock and disbelief. "Ebuka?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What? What happened? Why am I here?" Ebuka could barely form the words. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared himself for grief, for the final farewell to the love of his life, but not for this, for her to return from the dead. He swallowed hard, stepping closer, but his hands shook. "Amara, He started, but the words failed him. Amara, still disoriented, tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, as if they hadn't moved in days, and she leaned against the edge of her tomb for support. "I remember. I was sick," she said, her eyes darting around in panic. "I remember being cold. So cold. And then... darkness." Ebuka could only nod, still too stunned to fully comprehend what was happening. You were buried, Amara. You were gone," he said, his voice trembling. But now you're back. Tears filled Amara's eyes as she looked down at her own hands. They were pale, lifeless, yet warm with an inexplicable energy. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" Before Ebuka could answer, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, sending a shiver down both their spines. It was as if the earth itself had shifted in response to her resurrection. Ebuka's heart sank, realizing that what had just happened was far from natural. "We need to leave here," Ebuka said quickly, looking around as if the night itself was watching them. He extended his hand toward Amara, but she hesitated. "I don't understand any of this," she murmured, shaking her head. "This is not right." As the two finally made their way out of the cemetery, something felt different. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the moon, which had seemed so bright moments ago, was now partially obscured by clouds. The village was eerily silent, and not a soul stirred as they hurried toward Ebuka's small home on the outskirts. When they entered, Amara sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "What will people say when they find out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was buried, Ebuka. My family mourned me. They will think this is witchcraft." Ebuka knelt beside her, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. "We won't tell anyone." "Not yet," he said softly. "Let me protect you. I don't understand how this happened either, but I couldn't let you go." Amara's eyes softened as she looked at him. "You did this because of love?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Ebuka nodded. "I loved you, Amara. I've loved you for so long. Even though I knew you would never love me back. Even though you didn't know I existed. But now you're here, alive." Amara looked away, the weight of her resurrection pressing down on her. She hadn't realized the depth of Ebuka's feelings until now. His desperation had brought her back from the dead, but for what? And at what cost? Suddenly, the flickering light of the oil lamp cast shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. A cold chill swept through the room again, and a strange sound echoed from outside, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. Ebuka froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Amara nodded slowly, her eyes wide with fear. "Something isn't right, Ebuka. I can feel it. It's like something is following us." Before either of them could react, a loud knock echoed from the door. They both jumped, staring at the door in silence. "Who could it be at this hour?" Amara whispered. Ebuka stood slowly, his heart pounding as he moved toward the door. His hand shook as he reached for the handle, and with a deep breath, he opened it. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, her face hidden in the shadows of her hooded cloak. Her voice was raspy and unsettling as she spoke. "You have tampered with the laws of nature," she said, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Amara's return comes with a price neither of you are ready to pay." The elderly woman's words hung heavy in the air, sending a chill down Ebuka's spine. He could barely speak, his mouth dry as he stepped back from the door. Amara, seated in the corner of the room, was trembling. Her wide eyes fixed on the old woman, and an unsettling fear crept into her heart. "What do you mean a price?" Ebuka finally asked, his voice shaking. The woman stepped into the dimly lit room, her presence filling the space with an eerie weight. Her wrinkled face emerged from beneath her hood, and her piercing eyes locked onto Amara. "Life does not return to the dead without consequence," she said, her voice low and filled with a strange authority. "You have disturbed the balance, young man. The dead are meant to rest, and those who defy that law will face the wrath of forces older than time itself. Amara stood up, her body still weak but her mind sharper now. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you know about this?" The old woman's gaze softened as she turned toward Amara. "I am known as Ijeoma, the keeper of secrets. I have lived long enough to know that no one returns from the grave unchanged. You were brought back by an act of love, but love alone cannot shield you from the darkness that follows. Your resurrection has awakened something far more dangerous than you can imagine." Ebuka, still reeling from the shock, stepped forward. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," he said desperately. I couldn't let her go." Ijeoma shook her head. "Your intentions, though pure, have set events in motion that cannot be undone. The village will soon know of this unnatural occurrence, and when they do, they will not show mercy. The living do not welcome the return of the dead." Amara's heart sank. She had only just begun to comprehend the strange reality of her resurrection. Her mind raced as memories of her sickness flooded back. The fever, the coldness, the darkness that had consumed her, none of it made sense. How had she been pulled back from death? And what was the true cost? "Tell us, Ijeoma," Amara said softly, her voice steadying. "What must we do to set things right?" Ijeoma's eyes gleamed in the flickering light of the oil lamp. "There is only one way to appease the forces that have been disturbed," she said. "You must return to the grave before the next full moon. If you do not, the village will suffer, and your soul, Amara, will be trapped between the world of the living and the dead for eternity." Ebuka's heart dropped. "No," he said firmly. "There must be another way. She can't just go back to the grave." Ijeoma's expression darkened. "There are no other ways, young man. This is the cost of your actions. The balance must be restored." Amara, her mind spinning with fear and confusion, stumbled back into her chair. I don't understand," she whispered. "How can I return? I'm alive now. I feel everything. How can I just go back?" Ijeoma's voice softened, and she looked at Amara with something resembling pity. "I understand your confusion, child. The lines between life and death are blurred for you now, but your time here is borrowed. If you remain, both you and those you love will suffer. Death may not be the end for you, but it is the only way to restore what has been lost." Ebuka's eyes filled with tears as he turned to Amara. "I can't lose you again," he whispered. "There has to be something, anything else we can do." Ijeoma sighed and turned toward the door. "The choice is yours to make," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "But choose wisely. The full moon is only days away, and with each passing night, the forces that follow you grow stronger." Without another word, she disappeared into the night, leaving Ebuka and Amara alone with the terrifying truth. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the very air had become suffocating. Amara stood, shakily walking toward Ebuka, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Ebuka, I don't want to go back," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. "I want to live. I want to be with you." Ebuka pulled her into his arms, his heart breaking. "We'll figure something out," he whispered, holding her close. "We won't let her win. There has to be another way." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The eerie occurrences had already begun. The whispers outside, the unnatural coldness, and now the warning from Ijeoma, it all pointed to something far more sinister than either of them could comprehend. As they clung to each other, the sound of distant whispers grew louder, filling the night air with an ominous presence. And somewhere, deep within the forest, something stirred. The days passed in a blur, and the tension in the village grew thick with unease. It seemed as though the air itself carried whispers, and the villagers began noticing strange occurrences. Livestock were found dead without explanation, crops withered overnight, and an unsettling silence lingered in the streets. No one could explain what was happening, but the elders sensed something dark was brewing. Ebuka and Amara had become more withdrawn, keeping to themselves in his small home. Ebuka, refusing to give up, spent every waking moment trying to find another solution, anything that could save Amara from returning to the grave. He visited herbalists, wise men, and even the priests, but no one had answers. Each door he knocked on brought more fear and less hope. Amara, though alive, was growing weaker. Her once radiant beauty had dimmed, and she often complained of feeling cold, even in the midday sun. Every time she looked into the mirror, she noticed her reflection becoming more ghostly, as if her very existence was fading. The full moon was only 2 nights away, and with each passing moment, the weight of Ijoma's warning pressed heavily on them both. One evening, as they sat in silence, Amara suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it, Ebuka. Something is pulling me, dragging me back to where I came from." Ebuka shook his head fiercely. "No, Amara, don't say that. We'll find a way. There has to be something we haven't tried." Amara's eyes were filled with sorrow, but she forced a weak smile. "I know you're trying to save me, but maybe I wasn't meant to come back. I feel like I'm not truly here anymore. Like I'm caught between 2 worlds." Before Ebuka could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door, loud and insistent. His heart leaped into his throat. Who would be visiting them at this hour, especially with the village under such a dark cloud? He cautiously opened the door to find none other than Chief Nadozi, Amara's father. The old chief looked disheveled, his eyes wild with fear. "Ebuka, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage and terror. Ebuka was taken aback, but before he could answer, Nadozi pushed past him into the house. His gaze fell on Amara, who sat weakly in the corner, her face pale and her eyes distant. The chief's face twisted with horror. "Amara," he gasped, taking a step back. This can't be. You were buried. I saw it with my own eyes. You're supposed to be dead." Amara looked up at her father, her heart breaking. "Father, I don't know how to explain it, but I'm here, I'm alive." Nadozi shook his head, backing away. "No. This is unnatural. This is the work of dark forces." He turned to Ebuka, his voice rising in anger. "You did this, didn't you? You couldn't accept that she was gone, so you used some kind of forbidden magic to bring her back." Ebuka's hands clenched into fists, but he fought to keep his composure. "I didn't use any magic," he said through gritted teeth. "I just wanted her back. I never imagined this would happen." The chief's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, the anger faded, replaced by deep sorrow. "She was at peace, Ebuka. Now you've cursed her and this entire village. The gods will not stand for this." Suddenly, Amara cried out in pain, clutching her chest. Her body began to tremble violently, and she collapsed to the floor. Ebuka rushed to her side, but no matter what he did, her convulsions only grew worse. "Amara, stay with me," he shouted, his voice breaking. Chief Nadozi watched in horror as his daughter's body twisted and shook. "The full moon is coming," he muttered under his breath. "This is the curse Ijoma warned us about." Ebuka's blood ran cold. He had hoped to avoid it, to find another way, but now it seemed the full moon was calling Amara back to the grave. He could feel her slipping away, her body growing colder by the second. Just as suddenly as it began, the trembling stopped, and Amara lay still, her breathing shallow. Ebuka held her close, tears streaming down his face. "I won't let you go," he whispered. "I won't." Chief Nadozi knelt beside them, his eyes filled with grief. "There's no escaping this, Ebuka," he said quietly. "Amara's return has brought a curse upon us all. The village is suffering, and it will only get worse if we don't act." Ebuka looked up at the chief, his eyes filled with desperation. "What are you saying?" Nadozi swallowed hard. "We must take her back to the grave. The full moon is tomorrow night. If she doesn't return by then, the forces that brought her back will take their vengeance on all of us." Ebuka's heart broke at the words. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Amara again, but the village was already falling apart. The strange occurrences, the whispers, the death, it all pointed to one conclusion. Amara's presence was tied to something dark and dangerous, and if they didn't do something, the entire village would pay the price. Amara, weak but conscious, reached out and touched Ebuka's hand. "It's time," she said softly. "I can feel it. I'm not meant to stay." Ebuka shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No. I can't lose you again. I won't." But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no escaping the curse. The full moon was coming, and with it, the forces that sought to reclaim Amara's life. As the night wore on, Ebuka and Chief Nadozi prepared for what would be the hardest decision of their lives, taking Amara back to the grave. But as the full moon approached, they began to realize that the true battle was just beginning. The village was on the brink of destruction, and the mysterious forces surrounding Amara's resurrection were far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. The full moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the village as Ebuka, Chief Nadozi, and Amara made their way to the graveyard. The silence of the night was deafening, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. The villagers watched from their homes, fearful of what would happen next. Amara's body was weak, her steps slow and unsteady. She knew her time was running out. The darkness that had been calling her since her resurrection was growing stronger with each passing moment. The closer they came to the grave, the colder the air became, as if the spirits themselves were waiting for her return. "I don't want to leave you," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. Ebuka's heart ached as he held her hand, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "We'll find another way, Amara, I swear." But deep down, they both knew there was no escaping what was to come. They reached the grave, the place where Amara had been laid to rest only weeks before. The disturbed earth seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the sight of her resurrection now a portal between life and death. Ijoma, the mysterious woman who had warned them of the consequences, appeared at the edge of the graveyard, watching silently from the shadows. Her presence was a reminder that the balance must be restored. Chief Nadozi stepped forward, his face etched with grief. "Amara," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wish things could have been different. But this was never meant to be." Amara looked at her father, her eyes filled with sadness and acceptance. "I understand, father. I should never have come back. My time is over." Ebuka's grip tightened around her hand. "No, Amara, please." His voice broke, but Amara placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle. "You gave me life again, Ebuka," she said softly. "But sometimes, Love means letting go. Suddenly the ground beneath them trembled, and a powerful gust of wind swept through the graveyard. The spirits that had been disturbed by Amara's resurrection were making their presence known. From the darkness, faint whispers grew louder, as if the very earth was speaking. Ijoma's voice cut through the air. It is time. Amara must return to the grave, or the village will be consumed by the curse. Ebuka's heart shattered, but he knew there was no other way. As much as it pained him, he couldn't allow the village to suffer because of his love. With tears in his eyes, he nodded. Amara smiled weakly, her body trembling as she knelt before the grave. She looked up at the full moon, its pale light bathing her in a soft glow. For a moment, it seemed as though everything had stopped. The whispers faded, and the wind stilled. It was as if the spirits were waiting for her to make the final step. With a deep breath, Amara spoke softly. I am ready. Suddenly, the ground beneath her shifted, and the grave opened once more. But this time, it wasn't a place of fear. It was a place of peace. As she descended into the earth, the energy that had haunted the village began to dissipate. The cold air lifted, and the strange occurrences that had plagued the village ceased. Ebuka fell to his knees, watching helplessly, as the love of his life returned to the grave. His heart was heavy, but there was a sense of relief in knowing that the curse had been lifted. Chief Nadozi placed a hand on Ebuka's shoulder. She is at peace now, my son. The balance has been restored. As the grave closed, the full moon seemed to glow even brighter, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging the end of Amara's journey. The village was safe, but the scars of what had happened would remain with Ebuka forever. Ijoma stepped forward, her eyes filled with wisdom. Love is powerful, she said softly. But we must remember that life and death are part of a greater cycle. When we disrupt that cycle, there are consequences. Ebuka nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand now. Ijoma looked at him with compassion. You showed great love, Ebuka. But love must also be selfless. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. As she turned to leave, Ebuka wiped his tears, the weight of the night finally settling on him. He would carry Amara's memory with him, but he had learned a painful truth. Life and death must be respected, and no amount of love could change the natural order. Moral lesson. In life, we must learn to accept the things we cannot control, especially the natural balance between life and death. Love is a powerful force, but it is not enough to bend the rules of nature. True love sometimes means making the hardest choice, letting go of what we hold dear for the greater good. If this story made you cry, please comment below. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons it carries, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more African folktales and mysteries that explore the depth of love, life, and the supernatural. Remember to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's keep these stories alive for generations to come.